In the limestone-riddled wilderness of the Missouri Ozarks, 15 miles from Springfield, where Civil War chaos had barely settled and lawlessness festered in isolated hollows, two brothers operated a wayside cabin that became a charnel house disguised as frontier hospitality. Between 1863 and December 1867, Elias and Jeremiah Hartley perfected a system of methodical murder that claimed 73 lives through poisoned kindness, offering weary travelers water from their well, serving coffee laced with sedative herbs, and watching with clinical detachment as guests' limbs grew heavy before the final blow came. They disposed of bodies in a sinkhole that plunged 300 feet into the Ozarks' limestone depths, creating a mass grave that swallowed evidence of their crimes. But in December 1867, a survivor escaped their cabin and staggered into Springfield, bearing testimony that would trigger the largest manhunt in post-Civil War Missouri history. What law enforcement discovered in that cabin, and what they found when they finally plumbed the depths of the brothers' sinkhole, would haunt the Ozarks for generations. Before we descend into this nightmare, I need to ask for your support in pursuing an ambitious dream. This story was created by a young storyteller working to reach 1,000 subscribers by creating meticulously researched historical horror stories that honor real events and cultural traditions. Every narrative demands days of archival research, examination of historical records, and careful attention to period details that bring authenticity to atmospheric terror. If you subscribe right now, you're helping prove that quality storytelling rooted in documented history can find an audience in our digital age. He promises this: every new subscriber inspires me to dig deeper into forgotten archives, to spend more hours ensuring historical accuracy, and to craft stories that educate while they terrify. Your subscription is an investment in increasingly better content, and he thank you sincerely. Now, let me take you back to 1863 Missouri, where the Civil War's end brought not peace, but a different kind of horror to the Ozark wilderness. The spring of 1863 arrived in the Missouri Ozarks not as renewal, but as exhaustion. The Civil War, which had torn the nation apart since April 1861, had transformed the borderlands between Union and Confederate territory into a landscape of guerrilla violence, burned farms, and communities shattered along fault lines of divided loyalty. Southwest Missouri, with its proximity to both Kansas abolitionist militants and Arkansas Confederate strongholds, had become particularly savage terrain, where conventional armies gave way to irregular forces that recognized no rules of civilized warfare. Springfield, the regional center situated in Greene County, with a population approaching 4,000 souls, had witnessed the first major Civil War engagement west of the Mississippi River in August 1861, the Battle of Wilson's Creek, where over 5,000 Union troops clashed with 12,000 Confederates in fighting that left over 2,000 casualties scattered across southwest Missouri farmland. The Union forces retreated, leaving Springfield under Confederate control until recaptured in early 1862. Then came the Battle of Springfield in January 1863, when Confederate General John Marmaduke attacked the city attempting to seize its military stores. Though the attack failed, over 100 men died in street fighting that reduced portions of the city to rubble. This cycle of attack, occupation, and recapture transformed Springfield and its surrounding territory into a war-ravaged landscape where normal governance collapsed. The county courthouse burned, law enforcement dissolved as sheriffs either fled, died, or abandoned their posts in favor of survival. Democratic and Republican factions, which had previously competed through electoral politics, now settled disputes through bushwhacker raids and militia reprisals that targeted civilians as frequently as combatants. In one 90-day period following the war's formal conclusion in April 1865, Taney County alone saw 4 different sheriffs, each either murdered, driven out, or rendered ineffective by the chaos that military defeat had failed to resolve. Into this vacuum of authority moved men for whom lawlessness represented opportunity rather than crisis. The Ozarks, with their rugged topography of steep hollows, dense forests, and limestone cave systems that honeycombed the region, offered perfect sanctuary for outlaws, deserters, and criminals who recognized that the war's chaos would prevent effective pursuit. The landscape itself seemed designed for concealment. Thick vegetation obscured sightlines, narrow valleys funneled travelers along predictable routes, and the karst geology created sinkholes and caves where bodies could disappear without trace. 15 miles from Springfield, along a rutted track that served as primitive road connecting the town to isolated farmsteads and timber camps deeper in the Ozark wilderness, stood a log cabin that travelers welcomed as way station offering respite from difficult journeys. The cabin occupied strategic location where the track crossed a seasonal creek, providing water source for horses and travelers alike. More significantly, it sat adjacent to a natural limestone well that local residents had used for generations, a cylindrical shaft approximately 8 feet in diameter that plunged straight down through solid rock before opening into underground cavern system fed by cold springs. The cabin belonged to 2 brothers who had arrived in the region in late 1862, claiming to be displaced farmers from southern Missouri whose property had been destroyed during guerrilla raids. Elias Hartley, the elder at age 36, was a lean man with intense eyes and the manner of someone who had seen considerable hardship. His brother Jeremiah, 28, possessed a more affable demeanor that put travelers at ease. He smiled readily, asked questions about their journeys, and offered hospitality that seemed genuine rather than calculated. The brothers established themselves as respectable frontier entrepreneurs. They maintained the cabin as way station where travelers could purchase meals, rest their horses, and obtain directions through the confusing network of tracks and game trails that constituted Ozark's transportation infrastructure. They charged modest fees, a few cents for water from their well, 25 cents for a hot meal, 50 cents for overnight accommodation in the cabin's loft area. These prices aligned with frontier economy norms, making the cabin an attractive stopover for merchants transporting goods between Springfield and outlying settlements, for farmers traveling to market, for circuit-riding preachers and itinerant workers, and for families relocating through the chaos of war's aftermath. Jeremiah Hartley served as primary host, greeting arrivals with cheerful welcome that contrasted sharply with the grim circumstances most travelers experienced in war-torn Missouri. He would take horses to the small corral behind the cabin, ensuring they had access to water and whatever fodder the brothers could provide. He would invite guests into the cabin's main room, where a fire burned year-round for cooking and warmth. And he would offer what became the brothers' signature hospitality, a cup of water drawn fresh from the limestone well, served in tin cups that hung on hooks beside the cabin door. The water was exceptionally cold and pure, as limestone-filtered spring water typically is in the Ozarks. Travelers, often exhausted from hours navigating rough tracks through hilly terrain, drank gratefully, appreciating the brothers' generosity in providing refreshment without charge before discussing accommodation and meal arrangements. Many commented on the water's quality, how it tasted cleaner than creek water, how the coldness refreshed even in summer heat, how fortunate the brothers were to have such excellent well adjacent to their property. What none of the travelers knew was that Jeremiah Hartley had learned botanical medicine during the war while serving as assistant to a disgraced Union Army surgeon who had been dismissed for drunkenness and medical malpractice, but who retained extensive knowledge of frontier pharmacology. Jeremiah had absorbed lessons about which plants produced sedative effects, which herbs could be processed into tinctures that caused drowsiness and muscular weakness, and which substances could be administered in small doses that wouldn't immediately alarm victims, but would accumulate in their systems to devastating effect. The water from the limestone well, drawn fresh and cold each day, became Jeremiah's delivery mechanism for herbal sedatives extracted from plants that grew abundantly in Ozark forests. Valerian root, which produced calming effects and drowsiness. White snake root, which caused tremors and weakness when consumed repeatedly. And most cunningly, small amounts of jimsonweed, Datura stramonium, whose anticholinergic alkaloids created confusion, disorientation, and inability to resist or call for help as the poison accumulated in victims' bloodstreams. The brothers refined their methodology through experimentation that began in late 1862 and early 1863. Early victims were likely lone travelers whose disappearances attracted minimal attention in a region where guerrilla violence and road bandits made missing persons commonplace. The brothers learned proper dosing, enough sedative to incapacitate, but not so much that victims immediately recognized poisoning. They discovered that serving the tainted water first, followed by hot coffee that masked any residual bitter taste from the herbal extracts, created reliable progression where guests became drowsy within 30 minutes, confused and weak within an hour, and utterly helpless within 2 hours. Once victims reached the helpless stage, unable to stand without assistance, unable to mount horses or defend themselves, unable to process what was happening through the fog of anticholinergic delirium, the brothers moved to the next phase. Elias, the more physically powerful brother, would approach the victim with sympathy, suggesting that the traveler must be suffering from road exhaustion or illness. He would help them outside, ostensibly to get fresh air or to access the outhouse behind the cabin. But instead of providing care, Elias would walk the stumbling victim toward the limestone well. The well, which travelers had admired for its clear, cold water, was actually a geological feature known as a sinkhole, a vertical shaft created over millions of years as slightly acidic rainwater dissolved the Ozark's limestone bedrock, creating voids that eventually collapsed to form cylindrical openings to underground cave systems. This particular sinkhole plunged approximately 300 feet straight down through solid rock, before opening into a cavern where an underground stream flowed through perpetual darkness. Local geological surveys would later classify it as a pit cave or vertical cave, features common throughout the Ozarks karst landscape, but particularly dangerous due to their shaft-like configuration that offered no ledges or breaks in the descent. At the sinkhole's edge, Elias Hartley would deliver the final act, sometimes a shove, sometimes a blow to the head with a wooden club that stunned victims before the fall, sometimes simply releasing his supporting grip and watching as sedative-weakened legs failed and gravity completed the murder. The victims plummeted 300 feet through darkness before striking the cavern floor, or, if they survived the initial impact, drowning in the underground stream that flowed through the cave system. Either way, they disappeared into limestone depths where recovery would be nearly impossible and where evidence of murder decayed in cold, wet darkness that prevented normal decomposition. After disposing of the body, the brothers would rifle through victims' possessions methodically. Cash, jewelry, watches, and valuable goods went into the brothers' private stores. Clothing was burned or buried to prevent identification. Horses were either sold at distant markets where questions weren't asked, or, if the animals were distinctive enough to attract recognition, killed and butchered for meat. Wagons were dismantled, their wood used for firewood or repairs, their metal components sold as scrap. Within hours of a murder, Virtually all evidence that a traveler had ever stopped at the cabin vanished, except for the body rotting in inaccessible cavern hundreds of feet below ground. The brothers' system proved horrifyingly efficient. Between late 1863 and December 1867, they murdered an estimated 73 people using this methodology, a staggering toll that made them among the most prolific serial killers in American frontier history. The victims included merchants carrying sale proceeds from Springfield markets, farmers transporting goods to town, itinerant workers seeking employment, families relocating through the post-war chaos, and even a circuit-riding Methodist preacher whose disappearance prompted particular concern but no effective investigation. The murders continued undetected for over 4 years because the Ozarks' post-war lawlessness meant that missing persons rarely triggered systematic investigation. When a merchant failed to return from Springfield, families assumed bandits had robbed and killed him along the road, a common enough occurrence that it required no special explanation. When itinerant workers disappeared, employers shrugged and hired replacements from the steady stream of displaced people wandering post-war Missouri seeking survival. When families vanished, neighbors assumed they had relocated to Kansas or Arkansas, or had been consumed by the guerrilla violence that continued sporadically even after Confederate surrender. The brothers cultivated reputation as trustworthy, God-fearing men who provided valuable service to travelers in dangerous times. Jeremiah attended church services in Springfield when weather permitted, presenting himself as concerned citizen witnessing to the region's moral decline. Elias maintained the cabin and its surroundings in good repair, projecting image of industrious frontier settler making honest living through hard work. They paid their modest debts promptly, caused no public disturbances, and aroused no suspicions beyond the vague unease that some travelers later reported feeling about the cabin. Unease they dismissed as paranoia generated by the general atmosphere of threat that permeated post-war Missouri. Inside the cabin, however, evidence accumulated that told different story. A trunk in the loft contained over 200 items of jewelry, rings, lockets, watches, brooches, far more than 2 bachelor brothers could possibly have acquired through legitimate means in 4 years of modest frontier commerce. Beneath floorboards in the main room lay cash equivalent to several $1,000s. Again, an impossible sum for way station operators to accumulate honestly. In the corral behind the cabin, the ground showed disturbances where horses had been buried after being killed to prevent their recognition and sale. Most damningly, the brothers kept a ledger, a practice Jeremiah had learned during his time with the army surgeon, who had maintained meticulous records of medical procedures and outcomes. This ledger, bound in leather and kept locked in a wooden box, contained entries documenting each murder with clinical precision. The victim's name when known, or physical description when anonymous, the date, the amount of sedative administered, the time elapsed before helplessness, and finally, a single word, well or sinkhole, indicating disposal location. By December 1867, the ledger contained 73 such entries, 73 lives reduced to bookkeeping, 73 murders treated as business transactions requiring documentation for operational refinement. The brothers' methodology reflected something beyond mere criminal opportunism or robbery motivated by financial need. The careful record-keeping, the systematic refinement of dosing protocols, the clinical observation of victims' deterioration, these suggested that at least one of the brothers derived satisfaction from the murder process itself, not just from the robbery that followed. Jeremiah's medical training had apparently provided not just pharmacological knowledge, but also a framework for viewing human suffering as subject of study rather than moral horror. By late 1867, the brothers, had accumulated sufficient wealth to contemplate relocating to California or Oregon, where they could reinvent themselves as prosperous businessmen whose capital derived from legitimate sources rather than serial murder. They began planning to close the way station, sell the property through intermediary, and depart Missouri before winter made travel impossible. They would complete a few final transactions, they agreed. Travelers who stopped before they concluded operations would receive the usual hospitality. Then they would seal the sinkhole, burn the ledger, scatter the jewelry across distant markets, and disappear into the westward migration that was filling the territories beyond the frontier. But in December 1867, their careful system encountered a variable they had not anticipated, a victim whose constitution allowed him to resist the sedatives long enough to recognize what was happening, to understand the mortal danger, and to fight for survival with desperate strength that even poison couldn't fully suppress. That victim's escape would crack open the brothers' secret, would trigger manhunt across 3 states, and would eventually lead authorities to plumb the depths of the Limestone sinkhole, where they would discover evidence of murder on a scale that shocked even hardened lawmen accustomed to frontier violence. The Hollow's hospitality was about to be revealed as hell disguised as haven, and the brothers' well was about to give up secrets that limestone darkness had kept for 4 years of methodical murder. December 18th, 1867 brought early winter cold to the Missouri Ozarks, with temperatures dropping below freezing overnight and creating conditions that made travel particularly miserable for anyone caught on the primitive tracks that connected Springfield to outlying settlements. A merchant named Thomas Eldridge, age 42, departed Springfield that morning with a wagon laden with dry goods, tools, and seed supplies destined for a general store in a hamlet 25 miles southwest. Eldridge was an experienced frontiersman who had operated his freight business through the war years, surviving guerrilla encounters and road bandits through a combination of caution, luck, and a reputation for fairness that made him less likely target than merchants known for exploitative practices. Eldridge made good progress through the morning, but by early afternoon, freezing rain began falling, the worst possible weather combination that turned roads into treacherous mud while coating exposed skin with ice. He pushed forward, hoping to reach shelter before nightfall, but the conditions slowed his wagon to crawl as the mules struggled through deepening muck. Around 3 p.m., with daylight already fading under heavy cloud cover, he spotted the Hartley brothers' cabin, a welcome sight offering respite from weather that was becoming genuinely dangerous. Jeremiah Hartley emerged from the cabin as Eldridge guided his wagon into the clearing, greeting the merchant with characteristic cheerfulness that seemed incongruous with the miserable conditions. He helped Eldridge unyoke the mules and get them into the corral with blankets to prevent hypothermia. He invited Eldridge into the cabin's warmth, where a fire roared in the stone hearth, and he offered what every traveler received, a tin cup of water drawn fresh from the limestone well, served cold and pure, despite the frigid temperature outside. Eldridge drank half the cup, then paused. Something tasted subtly wrong, not poisonous exactly, but slightly bitter beneath the clean mineral taste he associated with well water. He had consumed enough frontier water from questionable sources that his palate had developed sensitivity to contamination. This water tasted like it had been drawn through metal, or had absorbed something from whatever container held it. He mentioned the odd taste to Jeremiah, who laughed and explained that the tin cup sometimes imparted metallic flavor, especially in cold weather when metal contracted and potentially leached trace amounts into contents. Eldridge accepted this explanation and finished the cup, grateful for cold liquid after hours of dusty travel, despite the freezing rain. Jeremiah served hot coffee next, along with cornbread and bacon, simple frontier fare but welcome after the day's difficult journey. Eldridge ate while discussing his route, his destination, and the weather conditions he had encountered. Jeremiah asked probing questions about Eldridge's cargo, his business relationships in Springfield, and whether anyone knew precisely when he was expected to arrive at his destination. These questions seemed like normal conversation, the kind of information exchange that passed between travelers and hosts routinely. Eldridge answered honestly, mentioning that the general store operator wasn't expecting him on any specific date. Winter weather made travel schedules unreliable, so arrival could range across a week without causing concern. Within 30 minutes of consuming the water and coffee, Eldridge began experiencing symptoms he initially attributed to exhaustion and cold exposure. His limbs felt heavy, as if the exertion of driving through freezing rain had depleted his strength. His thoughts slowed, requiring extra seconds to process what Jeremiah was saying. A mild nausea developed, which he blamed on the bacon's greasiness. But then, more alarming symptoms manifested. His vision became slightly blurred, his mouth felt unusually dry despite having just consumed liquid, and when he stood to visit the outhouse, his legs wobbled with weakness that exhaustion alone shouldn't have caused. Eldridge had survived decades on the frontier through attentiveness to danger signals that more trusting individuals might have ignored. The combination of odd-tasting water, probing questions about his schedule, and now these unexplained physical symptoms triggered alarm that cut through the mental fog developing from Jeremiah's sedatives. He recognized with sudden clarity that he had been poisoned. The brothers intended to rob him, possibly kill him, and his survival depended on immediate action despite the drugs already circulating through his bloodstream. He forced himself to remain calm, to continue conversing as if nothing was wrong, while his mind raced through options. Running was impossible. He could barely stand, much less mount a horse or defend himself if pursued. Confronting the brothers directly would likely trigger immediate violence while he was in no condition to fight. His only advantage was that they didn't yet know he had recognized the poisoning. If he could convince them the sedatives were working as intended, perhaps they would lower their guard enough for him to attempt escape. Eldridge allowed himself to slump in his chair, head dropping forward as if succumbing to irresistible drowsiness. He mumbled something about feeling unwell, about needing to rest before continuing his journey. Jeremiah responded with feigned concern, suggesting that Eldridge must have caught chill from the weather and should lie down in the cabin's loft area. Elias, who had been silent throughout Eldridge's visit, finally spoke, offering to help the merchant outside for fresh air first, claiming that the cabin's heat sometimes made travelers feel worse before they acclimated. This was the moment Eldridge had dreaded. Being taken outside meant being walked to the sinkhole, meant being pushed or struck and sent tumbling 300 feet to his death in limestone darkness. But he couldn't resist without revealing that he was still conscious and alert, despite the drugs. He allowed Elias to help him stand, to support him as they moved toward the cabin door, to guide him into the freezing December twilight, where ice covered everything, and visibility was reduced to mere yards by the continuing freezing rain. Elias walked Eldridge away from the cabin toward the tree line where the well shaft opened its 8-foot diameter mouth in the earth. Eldridge forced his drugged limbs to continue mimicking helplessness, while his mind prepared for the single moment when he would need every remaining shred of strength. He could see the well now, a dark, circular void in the ground surrounded by stones arranged to prevent accidental falls. He could see Elias adjusting his grip, preparing to shove or strike. As Elias moved to push him, Eldridge twisted with desperate strength, using the momentum of the intended shove to spin away from the well's edge. His sedative-weakened muscles barely responded, but surprise gave him fractional advantage. Elias hadn't expected resistance from someone who should have been barely conscious. Eldridge stumbled away from the well, falling to his hands and knees in freezing mud, then forcing himself upright through sheer survival instinct. Elias recovered quickly and lunged after him, but the freezing rain that had tormented Eldridge all day now served as ally. The ground was treacherously slick, giving the merchant precious seconds as Elias slipped in mud while pursuing. Eldridge ran, or rather lurched in shambling gait that was all his poisoned body could manage, into the darkening forest. Behind him, he heard Elias calling for Jeremiah, heard both brothers crashing through undergrowth in pursuit. The chase proceeded like nightmare in slow motion. Eldridge's drugged system kept dragging him toward collapse, but terror activated adrenaline that partially counteracted the sedatives. He fell repeatedly, each time forcing himself up through branches and thorns. He lost his coat, then his hat, blood from a dozen cuts mixed with freezing rain on his skin. His hands went numb, then his feet. The forest spun around him, and he couldn't determine direction beyond, away from the cabin. The brothers pursued with methodical patience, knowing their victim was weakening with every minute that poison circulated through his bloodstream. They didn't need to catch him immediately. They could track him through mud and blood, could wait for the drugs and exposure to finish what the well hadn't accomplished. They called out with false concern, claiming they only wanted to help him, that he was confused and would die of exposure if he didn't return to the cabin's warmth. But as darkness fell completely and freezing rain intensified, the brothers faced their own limitations. They were dressed for brief excursion to dispose of a body, not for extended manhunt in conditions that threatened hypothermia. They couldn't risk lighting lanterns that would advertise their location to any chance travelers on the road. And most concerning, Eldridge was heading generally towards Springfield. If he survived the night and reached authorities, the brothers' entire operation would be exposed. They made decision to return to the cabin, gather their most valuable portable possessions, and flee before Eldridge could raise alarm. They would burn the cabin to destroy evidence, scatter into the Ozark wilderness where they had escape routes planned, and vanish before law enforcement could organize pursuit. Eldridge would likely die of exposure and poison, they reasoned, and even if he survived, his incoherent story about being drugged and chased through the forest would be dismissed as fever dream from hypothermia and exhaustion. But Thomas Eldridge possessed constitution hardened by decades of frontier life and, unknown to the brothers, a partial tolerance to anticholinergic drugs developed through repeated childhood exposure to Jimson weed-contaminated grain during his youth in Kentucky. The dosage that would have rendered most victims helpless merely impaired him severely, and his directional instinct, honed through years of navigating Ozark forests, kept him oriented towards Springfield even through the drugged confusion. He walked through the night, falling every few minutes, but always rising, always pushing forward. The freezing rain stopped around midnight, and temperatures plummeted further, creating conditions that killed through hypothermia within hours. But Eldridge kept moving, kept generating body heat through motion, kept refusing the sedative's invitation to lie down and rest. His last clear memory of that night was seeing dawn light, touching frozen branches, and realizing he was still alive. A farmer found him at first light, collapsed on the road approximately 8 miles from Springfield. Eldridge was barely conscious, suffering from advanced hypothermia, exposure injuries, and the residual effects of the poison. The farmer loaded him into a wagon and rushed him to Springfield, where a physician worked through December 19th to stabilize him, while authorities gathered to hear his story. Eldridge's testimony, delivered in fragments between bouts of unconsciousness and delirium, seemed almost incredible. 2 brothers operating a way station were systematically poisoning and murdering travelers, then disposing of bodies in a limestone well that plunged hundreds of feet underground. He described the cabin's location, the brothers' appearances, the poisoned water and coffee, and his desperate escape. He insisted authorities search the property immediately, though he warned that the brothers might have already fled. Springfield's acting sheriff, a man named William Clayton, who had assumed the office only weeks earlier after his predecessor resigned in frustration, initially treated Eldridge's account with skepticism. The merchant was clearly suffering from drug effects and hypothermia, both of which could produce hallucinations and false memories. Moreover, organized serial murder seemed inconsistent with frontier crime patterns, which typically involved impulsive violence during robberies rather than systematic poisoning operations. But a physician examining Eldridge confirmed the presence of anticholinergic alkaloids in his blood, evidence that he had indeed been poisoned with plant-derived substances consistent with Jimson weed or related species. Moreover, Eldridge's specific descriptions of the cabin, the brothers, and the limestone well matched what local residents knew about the Hartley property. And most compellingly, when authorities checked records, they discovered that numerous travelers had disappeared over the past 4 years after being seen heading toward or past the area where the Hartley cabin was located. On December 20th, 1867, Sheriff Clayton assembled a posse of 12 armed men and departed Springfield for the Hartley cabin. The 15-mile journey through post-storm conditions took most of the day, with the posse arriving at the cabin site around 4 p.m. as winter darkness fell. What they found would transform Eldridge's seemingly incredible testimony into documented fact and would trigger the largest manhunt in post-Civil War Missouri history. The cabin was empty, but not abandoned. The fire still smoldered in the hearth. Personal belongings remained scattered as if occupants had departed hastily. And critically, the brothers had failed to remove or destroy their most incriminating evidence. The leather-bound ledger sat on a shelf, its 73 entries documenting 4 years of systematic murder with bookkeeper's precision. The trunk in the loft overflowed with jewelry, hundreds of items that could only have come from victims whose bodies had never been recovered. The floorboards concealed cash, and in the corral, partially butchered horse carcasses showed that the brothers had been disposing of victims' animals to prevent identification. Sheriff Clayton and his posse spent December 21st documenting evidence while several members approached the limestone well to assess its potential as body disposal site. The 8-foot diameter shaft plunged straight down through solid rock, its sides smooth and offering no handholds for anyone who fell in. When posse members dropped weighted lines to measure depth, the lines paid out to over 300 feet before striking what felt like cave floor. When they lowered lanterns on ropes, the light revealed a vertical shaft that seemed to extend forever before opening into larger cavern space, where faint reflections suggested underground water. They had found the murder site. Now came the grim task of recovering bodies and identifying victims, and simultaneously, they needed to locate and capture 2 brothers who had vanished into the Ozarks limestone labyrinth, where caves and hollows offered 10,000 hiding places for fugitives who knew the terrain. The brothers' well had been opened. The secrets it held would soon be revealed. But the brothers themselves remained at large, armed and desperate, hunted through winter wilderness by posses determined to deliver frontier justice for crimes that had claimed 73 lives. The chase was beginning, and the Ozarks, with their limestone depths and hidden hollows, would determine whether the brothers escaped or faced reckoning for their methodical evil. The limestone sinkhole that the Hartley brothers had used as mass grave presented technical challenges that Springfield authorities, in December 1867, were barely equipped to address. Vertical cave exploration, what later generations would call pit caving or spelunking, required specialized equipment, training, and safety protocols that frontier Missouri possessed only in rudimentary form. Yet the necessity of recovering bodies, documenting evidence, and determining the full scope of the brothers' crimes, demanded that someone descend 300 feet through solid rock into cavern darkness that might contain dozens of corpses. Sheriff William Clayton sent urgent telegraphs to St. Louis requesting assistance from mining engineers and cave exploration experts. Meanwhile, he organized preliminary efforts using equipment borrowed from local farms and timber operations, rope, pulleys, wooden planks, and oil lanterns that would provide minimal illumination in the limestone depths. On December 22, 1867, 3 days after Thomas Eldridge had staggered into Springfield bearing testimony of poisoned hospitality, the first descent team prepared to enter the sinkhole. The volunteers included 2 miners who had experience working in shaft mines, a timber camp foreman accustomed to dangerous conditions, and Sheriff Clayton himself, who insisted on participating despite warnings that his law enforcement authority didn't extend to underground recovery operations. They rigged a wooden platform using planks and rope, creating makeshift lift that could be lowered and raised by crew above using block and tackle systems anchored to sturdy trees near the sinkhole's edge. Oil lanterns were distributed, along with cloth masks soaked in vinegar to provide minimal protection against whatever decomposition gases might have accumulated in the sealed cavern below. The descent began at dawn on December 22nd, with winter sunlight providing brief illumination that would disappear once the platform dropped below ground level. The miners went first, standing on the wooden platform as it was lowered foot by foot down the shaft. The limestone walls, polished smooth by millennia of water erosion, reflected lantern light in eerie patterns that made depth perception nearly impossible. The temperature dropped as they descended. The surface air was freezing, but the cave maintained constant 50-degree temperature characteristic of Ozark limestone formations, creating unsettling warmth relative to winter conditions above. At approximately 100 feet depth, the shaft's character changed. The perfectly vertical upper section opened into a more irregular cavity where water seepage had created small ledges and protrusions. The miners noted these features carefully. If anyone had survived the initial fall from the surface, these ledges might have broken their descent, possibly leaving bodies wedged at intermediate levels rather than falling the full depth. They signaled for the platform to pause while they examined several dark recesses with lantern light. What they found confirmed the worst fears. Scattered across ledges and caught in crevices were human remains in various states of decomposition. Bodies that had fallen from the surface struck these intermediate ledges with force sufficient to cause catastrophic trauma, and remained where they landed because the brothers had no need to verify deaths when 300-foot falls guaranteed mortality. The miners counted 5 distinct sets of remains visible from the platform, though limited light and difficult angles meant more might be present in areas they couldn't adequately examine from their position. They continued descent. Between 100 and 200 feet, the shaft maintained relatively consistent diameter and offered no more ledges where bodies might have lodged. The rope creaked ominously under the platform's weight, and the miners checked knots repeatedly, recognizing that equipment failure at this depth would be instantly fatal. The darkness was absolute, except for their lanterns, creating sensory deprivation that disoriented even experienced miners accustomed to underground work. Time became meaningless. They might have been descending for minutes or hours. At 250 feet, approximately 25 feet from the bottom according to their weighted line measurements, the shaft opened into the main cavern chamber. The lantern light suddenly reached farther, revealing a space approximately 50 feet across with irregular limestone walls and a floor that appeared to be a combination of rock and sediment. An underground stream, perhaps 4 feet wide, flowed through the chamber, its source and destination both vanishing into darkness beyond the lantern's reach. The sound of running water echoed strangely in the enclosed space, sometimes seeming close, sometimes distant, as acoustic properties played tricks on the miners' senses. The platform touched down on the cavern floor at 8:23 a.m., according to Sheriff Clayton's pocket watch, which he recorded in official notes that would later be used in legal proceedings. The miners stepped off onto uncertain footing, testing the ground before putting full weight on surfaces that might be stable rock or might be sediment covering voids. They raised their lanterns and swept light across the chamber, searching for what they knew must be present, but dreaded finding. The bodies were everywhere. Some lay near the base of the shaft where they had struck after 300-foot falls, their remains showing trauma consistent with terminal velocity impact against rock. Others were scattered across the chamber floor, suggesting they had survived the initial fall with enough consciousness to crawl or stumble before succumbing to injuries. Several had washed into the underground stream and been carried to locations where the water had deposited them as flow rates changed. The total count would take hours to complete, but initial assessment suggested that over 60 bodies occupied the chamber, far more than even Thomas Eldridge's testimony had indicated. The decomposition states varied dramatically. Recent victims, those murdered within the past few months, retained enough soft tissue for identification attempts. But bodies from the operation's early years in 1863, 1864 had decomposed to skeletal remains, with cold cave temperatures and limestone environment creating preservation conditions different from surface burial, but still allowing significant decay. The underground stream complicated matters. Bodies that had entered the water showed accelerated decomposition from aquatic scavenging and dissolution processes. The miners began the grim task of documenting what they found while maintaining psychological composure in an environment that defied easy processing. They were standing in a mass grave containing the remains of over 60 individuals who had been murdered systematically over 4 years. The victims had plunged through darkness, experiencing perhaps 5 seconds of conscious fall before impact ended their terror. Some had died instantly. Others had survived long enough to understand they were trapped in absolute darkness, with injuries that would prove fatal. The limestone chamber had witnessed suffering that its cold walls preserved in testimony of bones and decay. Sheriff Clayton, who had descended on the second platform load, supervised evidence collection. Each body was examined for identifying features, clothing, jewelry, physical characteristics that might enable family notification. Personal effects were catalogued carefully, with attention to items that might match descriptions of missing persons from Springfield and surrounding areas. The work proceeded slowly due to the horrific conditions, the limited light, and the emotional toll of handling victims whose deaths had been so methodical and callous. Among the bodies, the recovery team found evidence that corroborated and expanded upon the ledger entries found in the cabin. A merchant's leather satchel contained business documents dated to September 1865. A Methodist preacher's Bible, inscribed with a name matching a circuit rider who had disappeared in March 1866. A woman's locket with daguerreotype photographs of children, suggesting that families had been among the victims. A child's shoe, small enough to fit a 6- or 7-year-old, indicating that the brothers had killed entire families rather than just adult travelers. The discovery of children's remains transformed the investigation's emotional character from horror to rage. Frontier justice norms, which might have offered some understanding for robbery motivated by desperation or violence committed in passion, offered no mitigation for systematic murder of children. The brothers had invited families into their cabin, served poisoned water to parents and children alike, watched as entire family units succumbed to sedatives, and then disposed of them as casually as one might discard trash. This was evil that transcended frontier brutality into territory that Victorian moral frameworks classified as demonic. Over 3 days, December 22nd through 24th, recovery teams worked in shifts to bring bodies to the surface. The operation required rigging multiple rope systems, constructing larger platforms capable of carrying human remains, and organizing surface crews to receive and process each recovered victim. The limestone shaft became conveyor of death in reverse. Bodies that had plunged down in seconds required hours to bring up, with each ascent representing testament to lives stolen through poisoned hospitality. By Christmas Eve, 1867, the recovery operation had brought 68 distinct sets of remains to the surface. 5 bodies remained visible but inaccessible on intermediate ledges, requiring specialized equipment that wouldn't arrive until after New Year. The recovery team believed that additional remains might be present in unexplored portions of the cavern system, areas where the underground stream disappeared into passages too narrow or dangerous for exploration with available equipment. The official count would eventually settle on 73 victims, matching the number of entries in the brothers' ledger, though some investigators believed the true toll might exceed 80 when accounting for bodies that had washed into inaccessible cave systems. The 68 recovered bodies were transported to Springfield's municipal building, where a makeshift morgue was established to facilitate identification efforts. Families who had reported missing relatives were invited to examine clothing, personal effects, and physical descriptions in hope of matching victims to names. The process was emotionally devastating. Parents identified children's remains, spouses recognized clothing, and siblings discovered that relatives who had supposedly relocated west had actually been murdered within miles of Springfield. The identifications proceeded slowly through late December and into January 1868. Some victims were identified quickly through distinctive clothing or jewelry. Others required more detailed investigation, cross-referencing missing person reports with estimated dates of death and physical characteristics. And tragically, approximately 15 victims were never identified at all. Travelers who had passed through Springfield without leaving records, itinerant workers with no family to report them missing, or individuals whose decomposition prevented reliable description. These unidentified victims were buried in a common grave in Springfield's municipal cemetery, marked with a monument listing the known victims' names and acknowledging the anonymous dead. While recovery and identification efforts continued, a parallel operation intensified, the manhunt for Elias and Jeremiah Hartley. The brothers had approximately 3 days head start before the initial posse arrived at their cabin on December 20th. They were presumably armed, possessed survival skills appropriate to frontier conditions, and knew the Ozarks terrain intimately enough to evade pursuit through the region's labyrinth of hollows, caves, and forest. Most concerning, they had likely prepared escape routes specifically for this contingency, maintaining caches of supplies and identifying bolt holes where they could hide while manhunt intensity diminished. Sheriff Clayton organized the manhunt with assistance from federal marshals dispatched from St. Louis, Missouri state militia units stationed in Greene County, and volunteer posses comprised of citizens enraged by the discovery of children's remains among the victims. Rewards were posted, initially $1,000 for information leading to capture, eventually rising to $5,000 as weeks passed without progress. Telegraph networks spread descriptions throughout Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, and Indian Territory, warning law enforcement and citizens to watch for 2 brothers matching the Hartleys' physical descriptions. The brothers had vanished into the Ozark wilderness as completely as their victims had vanished into the limestone depths. Through January and February 1868, reported sightings flooded Springfield's telegraph office from dozens of locations across 4 states. Each lead was investigated, each sighting checked, but none produced capture. The brothers seemed to have achieved what so many outlaws attempted in the post-Civil War chaos: successful escape into the frontier's remaining wild spaces, where sparse population and limited law enforcement created opportunities for reinvention and anonymity. But the magnitude of their crimes and the horror of the limestone chamber discovery ensured that the manhunt would not diminish. The Hartley brothers had created one of the most notorious murder cases in American frontier history. Their cabin had been dismantled board by board, searched for additional evidence, and finally burned to prevent it from becoming macabre tourist attraction. Their limestone well had been sealed with heavy rocks and marked with warning signs, and their names had entered Ozark folklore as embodiment of evil disguised as hospitality. A cautionary tale about trusting strangers, about drinking from wells, about stopping at isolated cabins where hospitable brothers offered water that tasted slightly bitter beneath its cold limestone purity. The descent into darkness had revealed the scope of the brothers' crimes. Now came the pursuit across frontier wilderness, where limestone caves and isolated hollows offered 10,000 hiding places, and where winter conditions made tracking nearly impossible. The brothers were somewhere in the vast Ozark wilderness, and somewhere hunters were closing in. The winter of 1867 to 68 brought conditions that favored fugitives over pursuers throughout the Missouri Ozarks. Heavy snows fell intermittently from late December through February, covering tracks within hours and making travel treacherous on the region's primitive roads and trails. Temperatures dropped below zero on multiple occasions, creating conditions where manhunt operations risked frostbite and hypothermia for posse members who might spend days tracking leads through wilderness without adequate shelter. And the terrain itself, rugged hollows, dense forest, and limestone caves where two men could hide indefinitely with minimal supplies, rendered systematic search nearly impossible across a region encompassing thousands of square miles. Sheriff William Clayton coordinated manhunt operations from Springfield, dispatching multiple posses based on reported sightings and intelligence gathered from informants who might have encountered the brothers. The investigation proceeded along three parallel tracks: physical pursuit of the fugitives themselves, financial tracking of any attempts to liquidate stolen assets, and interrogation of anyone who might have had contact with the brothers during their 4 years operating the murder cabin. The physical pursuit generated dozens of false leads through January 1868. A pair of men matching the Hartley's descriptions was reported in Taney County, 60 miles south of Springfield. Posse investigation found 2 legitimate trappers who bore superficial resemblance but had verifiable alibis and no connection to the crimes. Brothers were spotted in Harrison, Arkansas, just across the state line. Again, investigation revealed mistaken identity. 2 men attempted to sell jewelry, matching descriptions of victims' possessions at a trading post in Kansas City. When apprehended, they proved to be thieves who had purchased the items from an estate sale, with documentation confirming legitimate, if unsavory, transactions. Each false lead consumed resources and time, while allowing the actual fugitives to increase their distance from Springfield and potentially escape into territories where Missouri's manhunt held no authority. Clayton recognized that the brothers possessed critical advantages. They had prepared for flight, likely maintaining supply caches and pre-arranged contacts who would provide shelter without asking questions. They knew the Ozarks intimately from 4 years of residence, including cave systems and hidden valleys where they could remain concealed indefinitely. And most significantly, they had financial resources from 4 years of robbery that would enable them to purchase false identities, transportation, and cooperation from individuals willing to overlook suspicious backgrounds in exchange for cash. The financial tracking proved more productive. Investigators identified several Springfield merchants who had purchased jewelry and other goods from the brothers over the previous 4 years. When questioned about the transactions, merchants recalled that the brothers had claimed the items came from estate sales, bankruptcy auctions, or travelers selling possessions to raise travel funds. The explanations had seemed plausible at the time. Frontier economy operated partially through such informal exchanges. But reviewing the volume of sales, investigators calculated that the brothers had liquidated approximately 60% of the jewelry documented in the cabin trunk, converting stolen property into cash that now financed their flight. This financial evidence suggested the brothers had accumulated between $3,000 and $5,000, a substantial fortune by frontier standards sufficient to purchase property under false names, establish legitimate business operations, or fund extended travel west. It also meant they didn't need to commit additional crimes immediately, allowing them to avoid the risky behaviors that often led to fugitive captures. They could live quietly, spending conservatively, waiting for manhunt intensity to diminish before relocating to California or Oregon, where their faces wouldn't be recognized. The interrogation track focused on identifying anyone who might have assisted the brothers or had knowledge of their escape plans. Investigators questioned Springfield residents who had interacted with the brothers, neighbors who lived within 5 miles of the murder cabin, and merchants who had conducted business with them. Most witnesses provided little useful information. The brothers had maintained careful social distance that prevented the kind of intimate friendships where confidences might be shared. They attended church sporadically, but never joined Bible study groups. They patronized businesses, but never lingered for conversation. They were polite, but never warm. Present, but never fully integrated into community fabric. However, one witness provided a lead that proved significant. A blacksmith in Springfield recalled that Jeremiah Hartley had commissioned specialized metalwork in November 1867. Locks, hinges, and reinforced fittings suitable for constructing secure storage or creating hiding places. The blacksmith had assumed the items were for cabin improvements or perhaps a root cellar project. But reviewing the order's specifications, investigators recognized that the metalwork would be appropriate for securing a cave entrance, creating a concealed bolt hole where fugitives could hide supplies and potentially take refuge if pursuit became too intense. This revelation shifted manhunt strategy. Instead of focusing solely on reported sightings in distant locations, Clayton organized systematic exploration of cave systems within a 30-mile radius of the murder cabin. The Ozarks contained hundreds of known caves, and probably thousands more that local residents had never documented. Many were small features barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but others were extensive systems with multiple chambers, underground streams, and passages that could shelter fugitives for months if properly provisioned. The cave-focused search began in February 1868 as weather moderated enough to permit extensive wilderness operations. Posses equipped with ropes, lanterns, and weapons explored caves systematically, searching for evidence of recent occupation, food caches, bedding materials, or the metalwork that the blacksmith had created. The work was slow and dangerous, with searchers descending into underground spaces where they might encounter armed fugitives in darkness that gave desperate men every advantage. On February 19, 1868, a posse exploring caves in Christian County, approximately 25 miles from the murder cabin, discovered a limestone cave whose entrance had been recently modified with metal reinforcements. The natural opening, approximately 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, had been fitted with a heavy wooden door hung on iron hinges, matching the specifications of the blacksmith's November order. The door was secured with a substantial lock from the inside, indicating current occupation. The posse surrounded the entrance and called for occupants to surrender. Silence answered initially. Then a voice from within, identified by several posse members as Jeremiah Hartley, responded that they were armed and would kill anyone who attempted entry. A standoff ensued that lasted through the afternoon and into evening, with negotiators attempting to convince the brothers to surrender peacefully while armed posse members maintained watch to prevent escape. As darkness fell on February 19th, the brothers made their move. Using the cave system's complex geography to their advantage, they attempted to exit through a secondary opening approximately 100 yards from the main entrance where the posse was concentrated. 2 watchmen posted at this alternate exit spotted movement and called out challenges. In the confused darkness, gunfire erupted, the brothers shooting as they emerged, the watchmen returning fire, and other posse members converging on the location drawn by the sound of combat. Elias Hartley died in the initial exchange, struck by multiple rifle rounds that killed him before he could fully exit the cave. Jeremiah, wounded in the shoulder, managed to break through the perimeter and flee into the forest. Posse members pursued but lost him in darkness and terrain that favored fugitives who knew every hollow and creek. By dawn on February 20th, Jeremiah had vanished, leaving blood trail that dogs tracked for 3 miles before losing the scent at a creek where the wounded man had apparently waded downstream to break his trail. Elias Hartley's body was transported to Springfield, where it was positively identified through physical description and tattoos that matched details Thomas Eldridge had observed during his brief time in the murder cabin. Searchers who entered the cave after the gunfight discovered extensive evidence of long-term occupation, food supplies sufficient for months, bedding, weapons, and most significantly, a portion of the jewelry taken from victims and not yet liquidated. The brothers had indeed prepared a bolt hole, and they had successfully evaded capture for 2 months by hiding in plain sight within the vast Ozark cave network. But now, Elias was dead, and Jeremiah was wounded and alone. The manhunt intensified with renewed focus. Jeremiah couldn't access the brothers' financial resources without revealing himself through transactions that would be reported to authorities. His shoulder wound, while not immediately fatal, required medical attention he couldn't obtain without risking capture. And psychologically, the loss of his brother and accomplice meant he faced pursuit alone, without the partnership that had sustained their operation for 4 years. Through late February and March 1868, reported sightings of Jeremiah Hartley flooded telegraph lines from across Missouri, Arkansas, and Indian Territory. A wounded man matching his description sought treatment from a frontier doctor in Arkansas. Investigation found a logger who had suffered legitimate accident. A traveler with shoulder bandages raised suspicion at a Kansas inn. He proved to be a Confederate veteran with war injuries. Jeremiah had become phantom, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. A fugitive who existed more in fearful imagination than in any specific location. The breakthrough came in mid-March from unexpected source. A Methodist circuit rider traveling through the Ozarks encountered a severely ill man in the abandoned homestead 20 miles southeast of Springfield. The man, delirious with infection from an untreated gunshot wound, identified himself as Jeremiah Hartley and asked the preacher to hear his confession. The circuit rider, recognizing the name from wanted posters that had been distributed throughout the region, agreed to hear confession while simultaneously sending a companion to alert authorities. Jeremiah's confession, recorded by the circuit rider and later used in legal proceedings despite questions about its admissibility, provided comprehensive account of the brothers' operation. He detailed how they had developed the poisoning methodology, how they had selected victims based on vulnerability and wealth, how they had refined their dosing protocols through experimentation, and how they had maintained the operation for over 4 years without arousing sustained suspicion. He claimed that Elias had been the primary instigator, that he himself had merely assisted from misguided family loyalty, and that he sought forgiveness from God and from the victims' families for crimes that haunted his fevered dreams. The confession's theological sincerity remains debatable. Jeremiah might have been genuinely repentant in the face of death, or he might have been manipulating the preacher to obtain medical intervention that could save his life. But its factual content proved accurate when investigators cross-referenced details against evidence recovered from the cabin and the limestone chamber. Jeremiah described victims whose remains had been identified, accurately detailed their possessions, and provided information about several murders that the ledger had recorded only cryptically. A posse arrived at the abandoned homestead on March 17, 1868, finding Jeremiah Hartley in terminal condition from sepsis infection that had spread from his untreated shoulder wound. He was transported to Springfield under guard, though his condition made escape impossible. Physicians who examined him concluded that infection had advanced too far for treatment with available frontier medicine. The wound had become gangrenous, and the infection had entered his bloodstream. Amputation might have saved him if performed immediately after the February shooting, but 3 weeks later, the option no longer existed. Jeremiah Hartley died on March 19, 1868, in Springfield's makeshift jail, with the circuit rider present to provide final spiritual counsel. He never stood trial for the 73 murders documented in the brothers' ledger. He never faced cross-examination about his confession's claims that Elias bore primary responsibility. He never answered questions about whether additional victims existed beyond the documented 73. His death represented both closure, the case was solved, both perpetrators were dead, and no further murders would occur, and frustration, justice through trial and execution would never be achieved, and some questions would remain forever unanswered. The bodies of both brothers were photographed according to frontier custom that documented criminal captures through visual evidence. The photographs, which survived in historical archives, showed Elias as he appeared after the February 19th gunfight. A lean, intense-looking man who in death appeared younger than his 36 years. Jeremiah's photograph, taken shortly before his death, showed a man wasted by infection, his features drawn and his eyes carrying expression that might have been regret or might have been simple pain from physical suffering. The brothers were buried in unmarked graves in Springfield's municipal cemetery, separated from the common grave, where 15 of their unidentified victims rested. This separation was deliberate. Citizens who had lost family members to the brothers' poisoned hospitality insisted that perpetrators not share consecrated ground with their victims. The brothers' grave locations were recorded in cemetery records but not marked with stones, creating burial sites that would gradually fade from memory as grass covered the disturbed earth and seasonal vegetation erased visible boundaries. With both brothers dead, authorities turned attention to closing remaining investigative questions and providing whatever resolution could be achieved for victims' families. The jewelry recovered from the cave was photographed and catalogued, with images distributed to families who might recognize items belonging to their missing relatives. Additional identifications resulted: a locket reunited with a widow, a pocket watch returned to a merchant's family, a ring identified by siblings of a murdered farmer. These identifications provided bittersweet closure, confirming deaths but allowing families to recover precious possessions and conduct proper burial services. The financial accounting revealed that the brothers had accumulated approximately $5,000 through 4 years of systematic murder and robbery, an average of less than $70 per victim, suggesting that most travelers they killed carried modest amounts rather than substantial wealth. This calculation underscored the particular evil of their operation. They had murdered 73 people, not for life-changing fortunes, but for incremental accumulation that provided comfortable living without spectacular wealth. They had killed for amounts that legitimate labor could have earned, transforming murder into business venture that generated returns barely better than honest frontier commerce. By April 1868, 5 months after Thomas Eldridge's escape had exposed the brothers' crimes, the case officially closed. Both perpetrators were dead. 68 victims had been recovered from the limestone chamber, with 5 more visible but inaccessible. 58 victims had been identified by name, with 15 remaining anonymous. The murder cabin had been demolished and burned. The limestone sinkhole had been sealed, and the Hartley brothers had entered Ozark folklore as embodiment of betrayed hospitality. A cautionary tale about trusting strangers, about drinking water that tasted slightly bitter, about stopping at isolated cabins where hospitable brothers offered kindness that concealed methodical evil. The manhunt was over, but the haunting had only begun. The limestone chamber, the poisoned well, and the 73 victims whose final moments involved realization that hospitality was trap. These would persist in Ozark memory and folklore, transforming real historical atrocity into legend that carried warnings across generations. The decades following the Hartley brothers' deaths in 1868 witnessed the transformation of documented historical atrocity into folklore legend that carried both factual memory and embellished narrative elements characteristic of oral tradition transmission. The murder cabin, the limestone sinkhole, and the 73 victims became central to Ozark cultural identity, a dark counterpoint to the region's pastoral image, a reminder that frontier hospitality could mask predatory evil, and a persistent warning against trusting appearances in isolated wilderness settings. The physical site where the cabin had stood became pilgrimage destination for morbid curiosity seekers through the 1870s and 1880s. Despite efforts to demolish the structure and obscure the location, local residents knew precisely where the brothers had operated their murder business. Visitors came to see the sealed limestone sinkhole, to walk the ground where poisoned travelers had taken their final steps, and to experience the location's atmospheric qualities that many described as oppressive and disturbing even decades after the crimes concluded. This dark tourism prompted local authorities to take additional measures to discourage visitation. The limestone sinkhole, which had been sealed with rocks in 1868, was further obscured by planting dense vegetation around its perimeter and removing the warning signs that inadvertently served as landmark guiding curiosity seekers to the location. The track that had passed the cabin site was rerouted to bypass the area entirely, though determined visitors could still locate the spot through local guides who supplemented farming income by leading tours to the murder site. The folklore that developed around the Hartley case reflected the Ozarks' cultural processing of trauma through narrative frameworks that blended documented fact with supernatural embellishment. Stories circulated that the limestone sinkhole was haunted by victims' spirits, that their screams could be heard on still nights, that travelers who camped near the sealed well experienced nightmares of falling through darkness toward limestone depths where cold water waited to receive their bodies. These ghost stories served multiple functions. They memorialized victims, warned against trusting isolated hospitality, and provided entertaining horror narratives that communities shared during social gatherings. Some folklore variants attributed the brothers' evil to supernatural sources rather than human psychopathology. Tales emerged claiming that Jeremiah Hartley had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for botanical knowledge that enabled the poisonings, that the limestone cave where Elias was killed contained an entrance to hell, or that the brothers were actually demons manifesting in human form to harvest souls through betrayed hospitality. These supernatural framings, while factually inaccurate, reflected cultural attempts to explain evil that seemed to exceed normal human capacity for cruelty. The Methodist circuit rider who had heard Jeremiah's deathbed confession became minor celebrity in religious circles, lecturing about the case's cautionary tale about sin, redemption, and the importance of spiritual preparation for death. His account of Jeremiah's final hours, published in religious periodicals and reprinted in newspapers across the frontier, emphasized the theological dimensions of the confession, while omitting or minimizing details about the systematic nature of the brothers' operation. This religious narrative served to moralize the case, transforming it from study in criminal psychopathology into sermon about salvation and judgment. Academic interest in the Hartley case emerged in the early 20th century as criminologists and historians began documenting frontier crime patterns. Researchers examined court records, newspaper accounts, and surviving artifacts to reconstruct the brothers' methodology and analyze how they operated undetected for 4 years. These scholarly treatments emphasized the systematic nature of the crimes, the botanical knowledge, the ledger documentation, the careful victim selection, positioning the Hartleys as early example of organized serial murder rather than impulsive frontier violence. However, accessing complete documentation proved challenging because significant portions of the case records were destroyed or lost through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The brothers' ledger, which had been preserved as evidence, disappeared from Springfield's court records sometime before 1900, possibly destroyed deliberately to prevent its transformation into macabre collector's item, possibly lost through bureaucratic negligence, or possibly stolen by souvenir hunters who valued its horrific content. The jewelry recovered from victims was returned to families or sold to fund burial expenses, scattering physical evidence across dozens of locations where it lost historical context. The photographs of the brothers taken after their deaths survived in archives, but images of the cabin, the sinkhole, and recovery operations were never systematically preserved. This documentary loss meant that later researchers worked from fragmentary records supplemented by folklore that had absorbed fictional elements through decades of oral transmission. Distinguishing verified fact from embellished legend became progressively more difficult as the 20th century advanced, and individuals with direct knowledge of the case died. By the 1950s, scholars studying the Hartley murders relied on sources several steps removed from primary documentation, creating scholarly works that contained accurate frameworks but uncertain details. The victim identification process, which had been incomplete in 1868, remained unresolved into the modern era. 15 victims buried in the Springfield common grave were never identified, their names lost because no family reported them missing, or because decomposition prevented description matching. Genealogists and historians attempting to complete the victim roster in the late 20th and early 21st centuries worked from fragmentary records, but gaps persisted. The anonymous dead remained anonymous, their stories erased by the same limestone darkness that had consumed their bodies. In the 1980s and 1990s, true crime writers and documentary filmmakers rediscovered the Hartley case, producing popular accounts that introduced the murders to audiences beyond the Ozarks region. These treatments varied in quality and accuracy. Some conducted thorough research and presented the case responsibly, while others sensationalized details and incorporated folklore elements without clearly distinguishing them from documented fact. The proliferation of versions, each emphasizing different aspects or incorporating different embellishments, further complicated efforts to establish definitive historical record. Descendants of identified victims, scattered across multiple states by the late 20th century, occasionally organized gatherings to commemorate ancestors who had died in the Limestone Sinkhole. These memorial events, held in Springfield, or at the approximate murder site location, served to maintain family memory and provide venues for sharing preserved stories about victims' lives before their final journey brought them to the Hartley cabin. The gatherings also facilitated information exchange that sometimes produced additional identifications. Family members comparing stories and artifacts occasionally matched previously anonymous victims to specific family lines. The murder site itself underwent various uses through the 20th century. The property changed hands multiple times, with owners typically unaware of the location's history or discovering it only after purchase when neighbors shared folklore about the poisoned well and murdered travelers. Several owners attempted to develop the land for residential or agricultural use, but persistent stories about hauntings and bad luck associated with the site discouraged buyers and complicated transactions. By the late 20th century, the property had reverted to forest, with the limestone sinkhole remaining sealed beneath vegetation and the cabin's exact location marked only by subtle depressions and stones that had formed its foundation. In 2003, the Greene County Historical Society designated the approximate murder site location as historical landmark, installing a modest marker that acknowledged the crimes without sensationalizing them. The marker text read, "Near this location in 1863-1867, Elias and Jeremiah Hartley operated a wayside cabin where they murdered at least 73 travelers through poisoned hospitality. Victims were disposed of in a limestone sinkhole that has since been sealed." This marker honors the memory of those who died and serves as reminder that evil can disguise itself in hospitality. The historical marker's installation generated controversy. Some community members argued that memorializing the murders gave the brothers notoriety they didn't deserve and transformed the site into attraction for dark tourism that exploited victims' memory. Others contended that acknowledging historical atrocity served important educational function, particularly given the Ozarks' tendency to romanticize frontier era while minimizing its violence and lawlessness. The compromise solution was a marker that acknowledged crimes without providing precise location coordinates or encouraging visitation, historical recognition without facilitation of morbid tourism. Modern forensic anthropologists and criminologists who study the Hartley case recognize it as a significant early example of several phenomena that would become more common in later serial murder patterns. The use of poison or sedatives to incapacitate victims before killing them, the maintenance of detailed records documenting crimes, the operation of murder site disguised as legitimate business, the systematic disposal of bodies in location that prevented discovery. These methodological elements would reappear in later serial murder cases, suggesting that the Hartleys anticipated criminal innovations that 20th and 21st century killers would independently develop. The case also illustrated how frontier conditions enabled serial murder through combination of factors that would be impossible in more developed regions. The isolation of victims traveling alone or in small groups through sparsely populated territory. The absence of effective law enforcement and communication networks that would have identified pattern of disappearances. The post-Civil War chaos that provided cover for suspicious activities and made missing persons investigations low priority. And the cultural expectations of frontier hospitality that made travelers trust wayside cabin operators rather than viewing them with suspicion. These enabling factors meant that serial killers who might have been quickly caught in urban environments could operate for years in frontier settings. By the early 21st century, the Hartley brothers occupied ambiguous position in American criminal history. well documented enough to be acknowledged by scholars, sensational enough to attract popular interest, but not sufficiently preserved in primary records to permit definitive, comprehensive analysis. They existed in historical twilight zone between verified fact and fragmentary legend, their crimes documented but details uncertain, their victim count established but individual victims' stories largely lost. The limestone sinkhole, where 73 bodies had been disposed, remained sealed beneath forest vegetation, its exact location known to few and visited by fewer. Local folklore maintained that the site was haunted, that sensitive individuals could feel oppressive presence near the covered well, that animals avoided the area, and that vegetation grew strangely around the sealed shaft. These claims defied empirical verification, but persisted in local consciousness as expression of collective trauma and memorial practice that transcended rationalist frameworks. For the Ozarks region, the Hartley case served as dark foundational narrative, a story that complicated romantic frontier imagery and forced acknowledgement that isolated hollows and hospitable cabins could harbor evil as readily as they provided refuge. The case entered regional identity as cautionary tale that parents told children, that communities referenced when discussing trust and vigilance, and that historians cited when examining the complex realities of frontier life beyond the sanitized versions that tourism promotion preferred. The brothers themselves, buried in unmarked graves that had long since lost visible definition, existed primarily as names attached to horrific crimes. No monuments marked their passing, no descendants claimed relationship to them. Their cabin had been demolished, their possessions scattered, their bodies returned to earth without ceremony or recognition. They had attempted to create profitable business through systematic murder, and they had succeeded for 4 years. But ultimately, they left nothing except trauma, grief, and cautionary folklore about trusting water that tasted slightly bitter beneath its cold limestone purity. The limestone memory persisted in the sealed sinkhole, in the common grave holding 15 anonymous victims, in the descendants who gathered occasionally to honor ancestors who died far from home through betrayed hospitality. The memory persisted in folklore that transformed documented atrocity into supernatural warning, and it persisted in the inescapable truth that frontier hospitality, celebrated in American mythology as expression of communal generosity and pioneer virtue, could disguise predatory calculation that reduced human beings to business transactions recorded in leather-bound ledgers with clinical precision. 73 lives, 4 years, 1 limestone sinkhole, 2 brothers who perfected the art of poisoned kindness and paid for it with their own deaths in frontier justice that denied them trial or execution but delivered mortality through gunshot and infection. The brothers' well had given up its secrets in December 1867, and the Ozarks, with their limestone depths and hidden hollows, had absorbed those secrets into collective memory where they would persist as long as communities told stories about the darkness that frontier isolation could breed. The final warning remained simple. Be wary of hospitality offered by strangers in isolated places. Be cautious of water that tastes slightly wrong. And remember that limestone darkness can preserve secrets for generations. But eventually, all wells give up what they've swallowed. If you made it to the end of this story, if you descended with me into that limestone sinkhole where 73 bodies lay in cold darkness, if you walked beside Thomas Eldridge through his poisoned escape and witnessed the manhunt that brought the Hartley brothers to justice, please hit that like button right now. Your like tells me you stayed through all 5 chapters of this frontier horror, that you engaged with documented history that many prefer to forget, and that the days I spent researching court records, frontier documents, and Ozark folklore created something that resonated with you. Every like represents someone who refused to let these 73 victims remain forgotten in limestone depths, And that commitment to remembering historical truth inspires me to continue excavating stories that power would prefer remain buried. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering their names. Thank you for ensuring that the limestone memory persists. Until the next sealed well gives up its secrets, remember to be wary of hospitality that tastes slightly bitter beneath its surface kindness.